Good morning, ladies. We're going to move on and take a look at the last part of CC12 now, where we're going to start to take a look at quantitative easing, or sometimes also known as unconventional monetary policy. So there are a couple of links that are attached to the presentation, which I've also now put on Teams, so you can go and take a look at that independently. And as you can see there, there's a how QE works from the Bank of England, and also the BBC News summary of how quantitative easing works. Okay, now if we take a look at page 32, so starting on page 32 on CC12, there is also an article about monetary policy since 2009, and that includes some information on the whole principle of quantitative easing and the way in which the Bank of England and the UK government sort of benefit from that. And one of the things to bear in mind is that all the things that have been going on with the pandemic and the fact that the government or the Bank of England essentially has borrowed something in the region of 800 billion. That is mainly due to the principle of quantitative easing, as we'll see. Now, you'll notice that within your booklet there are some references to both the quantitative easing, but also to on page 33 in your booklet. There's a reference to Powell, the textbook, pages 433 through to 438, which again gives you quite nice summary material on quantitative easing, how it all works, and some definitions, etc., that you might like to consider. And then within your booklet, there are 11 questions. I think it's 11, if I remember rightly, 11 questions, which are really all about making sure that you understand quantitative easing and how that all works. And these are actually listed on the PowerPoint, as you can see. So first and foremost, what was the main aim of QE? Who did the Bank of England buy assets from, and what sort of assets were they? So really all this is doing is testing your understanding, testing that you understand the way in which quantitative easing works, and that should hopefully give you some confidence as to what QE is all about. Now, obviously it's not the main form of monetary policy. Monetary policy, generally speaking, is manipulation of interest rates, but quantitative easing over the last, really since the financial crisis, I suppose, 2007, 2008, has become a much more important form of monetary policy, and essentially it's attempting to provide resources, in this case cash or capital, to kickstart and improve the economic development or economic growth within a country or within an economy. So I listed 5 questions there, and there are another 5, or another 6 in fact, which again is all about just making sure that you understand what some of the principles of QE are. The Bank of England video that's listed in your booklet on page 33 is a very useful intro to that, and then obviously you've got the 2 links here on this PowerPoint too. Okay, well, let's take a look at the transmission mechanism then. We looked at that for the way in which interest rate changes might have an effect, and in a similar way we've got a transmission mechanism which is not dissimilar, but this time for quantitative easing. So in this instance, we've got the Bank of England essentially purchasing assets. When you start to look at quantitative easing in a bit more detail, you see that is the principle. And in this instance, that is all about the Bank of England providing some confidence, some sort of policy signalling, maybe rebalancing a portfolio, providing market liquidity, and basically providing money, which then should influence the amount of bank lending that's taking place. It should also influence asset prices and the exchange rate. And then also, in this case, it might affect the cost of borrowing, the total wealth that's available, the spending and income, and then obviously trying to actually make sure that you're maintaining that inflation figure, or having that in the background, so that effectively, if we don't just print money or just provide money and do that without managing the process, then there's a danger that inflation might get out of control. So fundamentally the same sort of principles as interest rate, the transmission mechanism for a different form of, in this case, quantitative easing as opposed to interest rate manipulation. Okay. Now, in terms of the evaluation of quantitative easing, then again, there's quite a nice article at the bottom of page 34 in your booklet, which is there's a link to that. And then basically, in terms of the way in which we might want to consider this, there's a number of different ways in which we can take a look at that. Okay, so in the first instance, if we then take a look at page 35, there is some information which just explains in a bit more detail about this whole issue around QE, and specifically when we're trying to evaluate quantitative easing. So in the first instance, it's estimated that QE has actually contributed to higher growth and inflation, and one could argue that given what QE is attempting to do, well, that's then achieved its objective, hasn't it? Okay, so if we take a look at the different levels of quantitative easing that have taken place, and again, in one of the articles that you got a link to, I think it's that BBC News article on the bottom of page 34 in your booklets. There's quite a nice summary of the different forms of quantitative easing that have taken place and the size of those quantitative easings. And in the first instance, the first 200 billion of QE had the effect of boosting GDP by between 1.5% and 2%, but also increasing inflation by 0.7 to 1.5%. So again, making sure that quantitative easing is helping to stimulate economic growth, but also not causing inflation to go through the roof. Clearly, that's made it much easier and cheaper for governments to borrow, whereby the Bank of England essentially buying gilts and bonds. And the issue really is that it's been quite hard to measure the precise effects, because the argument is that if QE had happened or hadn't happened, would that have happened anyway? So there's a little bit of an issue around the efficacy of the research that suggests that maybe some of the other monetary policy or supply side or fiscal policies that the government might have been encouraging or implementing might have had the effect too, or might have had an effect to some degree. There are other things that were being supplemented, other schemes such as lending, such as funding for lending schemes and government support for mortgage lending, like in the housing market, and the Help to Buy schemes, which again could have actually created the stimulus, and it maybe wasn't necessarily just QE that was having the effect. And clearly, one of the issues around quantitative easing is it damages savers and pensioners, so it's going to hamper their spending power, because it could and has led to a fall in long-term interest rates. So thinking about interest rates, if interest rates fall, then clearly savers and also people who are on fixed incomes are going to be, to some degree, disadvantaged by that process, part of that process. And clearly there are other issues around this whole principle of how this quantitative easing, how has that been distributed. There's an argument to say that it's boosted stock markets as funds have moved out of bonds into shares. And clearly, if that is the case, those people that have got assets like stocks are going to be increasing their wealth. And so that's essentially going to cause an even greater wealth distribution inequality, basically to some degree caused by quantitative easing. Okay, so in terms of the way in which you might like to link that, and I think I have mentioned that previously, that why is the no miracle cure, that's a really good summary of quantitative easing and some of the implications of this particular policy, which will again help you to understand the whole process. Okie dokie, let's move on then. Let's take a look. There's another link that I'd like to go and have a look at, which just talks a little bit about how quantitative easing, which has been seen by some as a great saviour, hasn't necessarily been a saviour for everybody. So there's got a nice article there which looks at the whole millennial dream. Has that been killed by QE, and some of the issues around inflation in property prices, and the fact that in some cases those people who are in the process of becoming, the new economic elite, for want of a better term, are clearly being pretty much hamstrung by some of the policies that have taken place as far as QE is concerned. Okay, one of the last things that we need to look at as far as monetary policy is concerned specifically is this principle of forward guidance. And again, taking a look on page 35 in your booklet, there's quite a nice intro to that and exactly what it involves. And effectively what's happened is that over the last few years, really since Mark Carney was involved as the Governor of the Bank of England, he was previously Governor of the Central Bank in Canada, and he's only just recently sort of hung up his boots, for want of a better term, and it's now been taken over by Andrew Bailey as the Governor of the Bank of England. But one of the issues that Carney brought in was this principle of forward guidance, where effectively what the central bank does is communicate what it believes that the economic outlook is going to be like, what the policy plans are going to be. And to some degree, it was almost a case of allowing businesses, individuals, and policymakers to say, well, this is where we think, this is what we're planning to do, this is how we're planning to manage the economy, and to some degree provide some sort of agreed way forward, or effectively some stability, I suppose, for markets. So it was almost a case of, and you only got to watch the media or listen to the media, and they will often talk about the fact that the Bank of England is predicting such and such, or this is what the policy is going to be, and that was very much used as a means of almost informing the market, I suppose, and also to some degree trying to influence the market by saying, if we do these things, then we know that that's going to effectively improve matters. But again, all down to trying to provide a stable, confident environment, confident economy where householders are willing to spend, firms are willing to invest and increase output, and then lead to economic growth and all the positive benefits that brings. Okay, so that's on page 35. There are then some questions that you can have a look at. They are multi-choice questions, and so that runs from page 36 right the way through to the bottom of page 37. And what I would suggest you do is have a go at the questions, have a go at completing them, and then obviously within this presentation, as we'll see in a minute, the actual answers are included. Okay, but what I'd like you to do is try and go through the process of almost, process of elimination, and in your own mind explaining to yourself why you believe that the answer is either one or another. Okay, so I'll give you a few moments to do that. I suggest you try and stop the presentation, and then go through the process of taking a look at those 5 multi-choice questions. Okay. So welcome back. First question then, which one of the following is an instrument of monetary policy? Well, in this instance, it's actually the exchange rate, because taxation and government spending are both effectively fiscal policy as opposed to monetary policy. The inflation rate isn't an instrument of monetary policy as such, but clearly the link between the exchange rate and interest rates and how those two things can then influence the amount of money in an economy, and the value of money too, that would be considered to be an instrument of monetary policy. Okay. We take a look at the second question then. Again, we've got a relatively simple supply and demand diagram. So we've got a shift in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2, and then we've got some options that we need to choose from. Okay, so consider A, B, C, or D as those conditions most likely to have caused the shift from AD1 to AD2. Well, obviously AD1 moving to AD2 suggests that there's going to be a fall in aggregate demand, and then it's a case of then eliminate or thinking about the things that are likely to cause a fall in aggregate demand. Well, clearly an interest rate rise is going to cause a fall in aggregate demand. And then when we think about the other things that might affect aggregate demand, we think about the way in which aggregate demand is calculated. We've got consumption, we've got investment, we've got government spending, and then we've got the trade, or the difference between exports and imports. So in this scenario, if we had an exchange rate rise, for instance, we're going to then come to the point that we can actually say that this is actually going to be C. So the rise in interest rates would be essentially reducing the amount of borrowing, and a rise in exchange rates would essentially make exports more expensive. And so as a result of that, that would be something that would cause aggregate demand to fall. Let's look at the third question then. Unemployment has begun to rise in the UK. What should policymakers do? Already the Bank of England has cut interest rates. Also, the government has begun to spend more without covering all of it, the increase by a rise in taxes. So in that situation, it can be inferred from the data that in response to rising unemployment, in this instance, both monetary policy and fiscal policy are expansionary. So clearly, if we've got interest rates being cut, and also the government is spending more than it's raising in taxes, that means it's borrowing more money. So in that instance, both of those policies would be expansionary. The fourth question then, similar to question 2, the Bank of England raises interest rates to reduce aggregate demand. Which of the following combinations is most likely to reduce the effectiveness of such a policy? So in this case, our policy is using interest rates to reduce aggregate demand. So what would actually, in these combinations, what would that essentially then cause the policy to be less successful? And in this instance, we're talking about the three things: real incomes, unemployment, and indirect taxation, all doing things that are likely to not help the overall principle of reducing aggregate demand. So if real incomes are rising, unemployment's falling, and indirect taxation is falling, all of those things are going to suggest that rising real incomes is likely to mean that we're going to spend more. Falling unemployment would suggest that more people are getting employed, which again could fuel spending. And then obviously a fall in indirect taxation would suggest that we're not going to be taxed as heavily, so that's going to put more money into our pockets, and then as a result of that, we're likely to spend more. Okay, let's have a look at the final question, the final question in this section, which is where we're looking at trying to highlight and identify the correct statement, okay, about monetary policy in the UK. So, taking a look at the options, again, it's a process of elimination. But in some instances, we might be able to look at a response and say, well, this is definitely the answer. But in this instance, if we're talking about what's a correct statement about monetary policy in the UK, well, higher interest rates may reduce inflationary pressures, but they also may reduce employment. So that's one that definitely could be an issue, and it's quite an nicely evaluative statement, that, isn't it? In that higher interest rates may well reduce inflationary pressure, but if we've got higher interest rates, we've then got more expensive borrowing. It might then mean that businesses are less likely to invest, and as a result of that, that could actually reduce employment in that scenario. Okay, so that's basically the second part of the PowerPoint number 3, which basically looks at quantitative easing. There's one more thing that we're going to consider, which is the regulation of the banking system, but I think I'll do that as a separate PowerPoint and get that sent over to you as a narrated PowerPoint very shortly. So thanks for listening once more, and I'll post this onto Teams very shortly. Thank you very much.